good lunch. We're going to get back started with our We're going to get back started with our afternoon portion of the conference. Very pleased to introduce Dr. Jung Kim from Lewis University. Jung is a graduate of the University of Illinois at Chicago and was also the Dean's Merit Award winner while she attended UIC. And now she works with K through 12 educators at Lewis University. Much of her research has had to do with hip-hop pedagogy and critical pedagogy, very much aligned even with the work that Ernest Morel had been talking about this morning. So we're very pleased to have Jung with us today to unpack, again, what does this mean to be responsive with students, and what are we doing for our students in our context. So please give a warm welcome to Jung Kim.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be going on after lunch when there will be a coma that will overcome all of you. I do tend to talk fast. I remember even in my student teaching observations, that was a critique I received. So if I start talking too fast, you can start waving your arms, looking crazy, all of that. So my talk is Teaching is Political, Teaching with, for, or against students. And I was actually talking to Ernest Morel outside about some of the conversations I was having with my class last night about the state of education, and it was kind of depressing. And I'm going to talk about some of those same things, but hopefully also bring up issues that will help you think about rising to the challenge of teaching and what that means. So you don't have to write this down necessarily, but kind of in your head even, you can think about, what do you think the purpose of education should be? So take a minute or two and think about what you think the purpose of education should be or is. And there's a lot of different ways you can think about that. Okay. Now this is a slightly different question. What do you think, or what do you want education for your children, if you have kids or grandchildren, if you don't plan on having kids, nieces, nephews, whatever children there may be in your life, what do you want education for your children to be? And if you've just a few seconds to kind of do that, turn to your neighbor and just briefly discuss what you said for both of those, and just see kind of what you came up with and if there's commonalities or differences. right, take maybe 30 seconds to wrap up a little bit. All right. Does anyone want to share their responses? Yes, in the front.
Prepare for life, success, good, comfortable life, appreciation for learning, value education, value books.
Okay, so a lot of preparing for life, education, valuing of education and learning. Okay. And were your answers different or similar from one to the other?
Said that felt we should listen to the difference.
Okay.
We want for our school children the same that we want for our biological children, that we want success and happiness for both. Doesn't matter.
Okay. Other folks, anyone have different responses or want to share their responses? Or everyone's afraid to all of a sudden? Okay.
Yeah, that's right. We talked about maintaining their individuality within the classroom and how that's important, that each student has their own voice. And a lot of times in education, it seems like they become too cookie cutter. Want to make sure that they're still their individual people.
Oh, that's good. I like that. Maybe one more, and then I'll share kind of my answers to these. Or everyone's on the same wavelength. They're all the same. Well, I'll share mine. Oh, does someone have one more? No, big fake out. Okay. So one of the reasons I asked these as two separate questions is initially I thought I would answer them the same way. But then when I actually sat down to do this, and the first question, what's the purpose of education, I do a lot in my teacher research class. And I did a very kind of typical academic answer, which is to say, I would say to be an engaged citizen armed with the critical and technical skills to be a fully contributing member of our society. And that sounds right. And it sounds probably like most of your school district mission statements, right? And maybe I want to throw in 21st century somewhere in there too. But then the second question I started thinking about, and I have a 3.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old, so they're kind of just on the cusp of schooling, really. But I was thinking, for the second question, I want them to make them love, I would want them to love themselves and to seek fulfillment. So a much more kind of an emotional response, and it might be because they're small children. And I started thinking about why do I answer those questions differently, and does that necessarily mean one is better over the other? So in preparing for this talk, I actually came across a quote attributed to Jonathan Kozol that he critiques the idea of education as being or he pushes for the idea that education is harmful when we're only preparing children for the economic development and not the growth and development of their inner selves. And I feel like so often we hear that about education as being this commercial process. What kind of job are they going to get? And we forget, it becomes almost a mechanized process then where education's not as much about the love of learning, it's not about valuing yourself or about learning how to really be part of society. And so this made me think a lot about Lisa Delpit's seminal work, Other People's Children, which is coming up on its 20th year of printing. And I thought about what does it mean then to teach other people's children, and how do I want my own children taught? And this was something I thought about a lot. I graduated from a North Suburban high school that was very affluent, very highly ranked, and then I taught on the west side of Chicago. And I saw some amazing teaching, I would say better teaching on the west side than I did in the north suburbs, because you had to motivate those kids. But I would also think about if I were to send my kids to this, would I send my kids to this school? And I struggled with the idea of what kind of teaching was I doing, what kind of teaching did I want for my kids? And to be frank, really, teaching's not an easy choice, particularly in today's climate. And I would argue that good teaching is an even more difficult one. Even over a decade ago, when the political climate was nowhere near as antagonistic towards teachers as it is today, the night before my first day of teaching as a high school English teacher, my parents tried to convince me I really wanted to go to law school, that I did not want to be a teacher. And they definitely didn't want me to teach where I ended up teaching. And even when I got ready to finish graduate school and I saw the fierce competition for jobs at the university level, as professors are getting furloughed and everything else we hear about, I had a brief thought in the back of my mind: if I can't find a job as a professor, I'll go back to high school classroom teaching. Little did I realize that it's actually even more competitive for a high school teaching job than it is at the university level. And so, I really was thinking about the state of education today and how things have changed. And recently, I've been hearing this phrase a lot: in the trenches. And you hear about teachers being in the trenches a lot, right? And so I kept thinking, despite the fact that trench warfare is an outdated method of fighting, right? But it kind of raises some of the questions of who are we fighting, right? Whose side are we on? Who are our allies? What are we fighting over? And then I would argue also kind of the bigger question of ultimately who are the casualties? And I think it's kind of a chilling question because too often I think it's the kids. Not on a physical sense, though there are obviously neighborhoods that deal with those issues as well, but thinking about why do we talk about education and teaching as being in battle? And if we are being in battle, who are we fighting? Is it the districts? Is it the kids? Is it the parents? And so I started thinking about this question of, are we working for, with, or against youth? And it brings me to the subtitle because I think about teaching as being political, but also politicized. And so we make choices every day that fall somewhere along one of these lines. So either you're working for youth, you're working with them, or you're working against them. And they're not mutually exclusive, which is, I think, some of the more troubling aspects of it. So even in the Chicago Public Schools, which is where I taught, so even as we force children across gang lines, disrupting homes and communities, and abandoning schools, we do it in their name, right? We're doing it to save the kids from these failing schools. We talk about how we can't allow children to be trapped in these failing schools and keep repeating mistakes, and that's something I kept hearing in the news commentary about it. Yet we're closing and reopening schools for a third or fourth time, or we transfer those children to schools that may be struggling or failing just as much as the ones they are coming from. And we're doing this all in the name of these children. And so then I asked the question, are you really working for the children, or are you working against them? Better yet, what does it mean to work with our students versus for them? And so doing something in the name of versus alongside. And then what does that mean within the context of literacy? So my husband and I have been talking about, so as our son is entering preschool and kind of some of the expectations literacy-wise for him, we've decided that if we were in kindergarten today with the knowledge skill sets that we had in kindergarten, that we would be remedial. Because when I was in kindergarten, I was singing along with records and tapes of the alphabet people, if anyone remembers those. So like tall, my teeth are so tall, and coloring stick figures of my family, and then as an English language learner, mastering really important words like bathroom. So obviously, as a kindergartner today, if those are the skills you're mastering, you're really behind. Right? And so when we talk about the literacy crisis today, particularly at the really young levels, we're talking about ratcheting up or down the pressures of the higher demands of literacy at the kind of the outcome end of it, right? And so with this, we think about what are the skills needed for 21st century, and then the expectations become higher and higher as we get actually younger. So we hear constantly about how we're failing as a profession, as a school, a state, and as a country, right? But I think we're doing an amazing job as a profession and keeping up with essentially a moving target, right? And so if you think about within a generation, the expectations of what it means to be literate today are very, very different from even just 10, 15, 20 years ago. And we're doing a really good job working within a system that seems inherently set up to fail. Now, David Stovall, who's at UIC, talks about the educational system is not broken. He argues that it does exactly what it's meant to do, which is it maintains the status quo, and it keeps the people who have continue to have things, and the people who don't have things to continue to not have things. And so for him, he talks about it as it's a system that works perfectly. So the maintenance of the status quo works to further exacerbate the inherent inequities of our society. So even last night, I was talking with a group of my students who are practicing classroom teachers in K-12, And they were talking about the wide disparity of resources that were in or not in their schools. And so we were talking about whether RTI worked, for example. And for the people who were coming from schools where they could get resources and knew how to do the curriculum and had external people, they were like, oh, it works. And then in the school where the woman's like, I have nothing and I have no one, she's like, it doesn't work. And so thinking about, what does that mean then for the kids that are in her school that are supposed to be getting these interventions or that aren't going to get labeled as having a disability because they keep getting shuffled forward. And then what does that mean for when they get to high school? So a group of literacy scholars about a decade ago called the New London Group wrote about how education's changing. On a local level, it's changing drastically, right? We have a ton of increasing diversity on a local level, but then globally, our world is shrinking, right? And so even I remember recently on Facebook, I saw a little ad that said something like, your shirt is from Taiwan, your hat is from this, your lotion is from, South America, and this whole list of how, we are a global society. And then at the end, it talks about how it's like, and you want to be anti-immigrant. And it kind of reemphasizes the idea of how we're so connected on so many levels that we take it for granted. And so kind of in conjunction with that, then the literacy demands that are expected from kids who are graduating is going to change. But too often, even in my own master's program, I heard fellow students in my classes talk over and over about how these kids can't learn and how, 20 years ago I was doing this stuff and it worked fine and these kids are failing and they're not working. And I remember thinking like, you're doing the same stuff you were doing 20 years ago? And I was kind of puzzled because in education, that seems acceptable. And yet, if you are seeking a cancer treatment, you're not going to be like, 20 years ago, that worked just fine for you, and let's just go with that, right? But in education, people think, well, that worked for me, and I survived, and I'm successful, and so that should be good enough. And it's not to demonize this population of teachers who are struggling with the changing nature of literacy and of education and the student population, but I would challenge you to think about, these teachers don't feel equipped to deal with the differences and to deal with a lot of the changes that are coming up. So what are some of the things we can do, and how can we push ourselves to learn and try to meet the needs of our students? Jim G., who's a linguist and educational scholar, has written extensively about what video games can teach us about education. Now, he's a little older, so I always argue that this is his way of, being an academic and still having fun playing video games. But he did do some really interesting work in looking at why do kids like video games and what is so motivating about it. Because they'll do it for hours, they'll read about it, they'll do all this extra work around what seems like a very, to me, I don't play video games, not a very exciting thing to do. But I know people get really into it. And one of the things he found was that despite the really great difficulty level or complexity and even some of the literacy tasks that were associated with these online video games, youth were deeply engaged and committed to mastering these games. And one of the reasons he found was that it's low stakes. So if you die in a video game, you can re-up the number of lives you have, you can start over, and you can do it over and over again. There's no one sending letters to your parents saying that you're a horrible video game player. There are no published lists of homes that belong to bad video game players, right? If you don't pass the test, you don't. Whereas in school, though, the stakes are high. So if you don't pass the test, you don't move on, you don't graduate, you're a certified loser, right? And in cities like Chicago, where the dropout rate is 50%, you have a city full of a large number of quote-unquote losers. And they are losing on a variety of levels. And so what this ends up doing is re-emphasizing this idea of being afraid of trying something new. And yet we ask our students every day to show up and to be uncomfortable, to try something new, and to expose themselves to the possibility of failure on a somewhat public level. And so similarly, teachers fall into the same trap as well. So if you think about your first year of teaching, you probably went in, you're like, I have all these great ideas, I'm gonna do all these wonderful, exciting things, and you go into survival mode, and you end up doing things like teaching daily oral language and diagramming sentences. Not that I have firsthand knowledge of any of that. But because despite all these great ideas you had, you end up going back to what's familiar, and it becomes the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. Or people say, oh, you have all these newfangled ideas from school, but you need to really teach the basics. And so, we kind of fall into this trap of wanting to be comfortable and wanting to feel like we know what we're talking about. So I'm not going to ask you to share this, but I would ask you, when was the last time you were publicly uncomfortable learning something? And one of the things I did several summers ago was I worked with some other educators on doing a hip hop workshop exchange. And what we did is we had teachers work in conjunction with youth, so I should say adult teachers, and they exchanged skills. So the youth taught the adults how to do graffiti, how to break dance, how to do kind of the different elements of hip hop. And the adults then, in turn, worked with the youth to create lesson plans or using hip hop in the classroom. One of my kind of impetus for doing this was I was thinking about how as adults we are so often in situations where we're comfortable because we can choose to be comfortable most of the time. But very rarely are we being publicly held to be uncomfortable. And I actually ended up having firsthand experience with this. So as a researcher, it's really nice for me to step back and be like, you guys learn how to be uncomfortable, please. I actually was forced to do this. So we were doing a breakdancing class, and I'm really clumsy. So one of the reasons I'm not walking around is I twisted my ankle recently, which is an annual event in my house. And so we were doing the breakdancing, and I was already horrified that I was going to make a total loser out of myself. And during the practice, when everyone's lined up and no one's looking at me, I did fine. And then with hip hop, as in actually in any large group dance situation, there's a circle that evolves, right? And they wanted everyone to take a turn in the circle. And of course, because I'm asking my teachers to do this, I'm like, well, I have to get in the circle. I got in the circle, it was awful. And it wasn't just awful in my head, it was awful because I was talking to the youth afterwards, and they were like, you were doing so fine in the practice, like, what happened? So, you can always love kids for telling you the truth. So I was like, yeah, it really was awful. It wasn't just in my head, I really bombed that. But I thought about, this is fairly low stakes. The kids weren't going to be like, you're a loser. They weren't going to make fun of me. They were very supportive. They were trying to be like, you were doing really good in the practice part. It's just when you got in the circle. And so similarly, kids do this all the time. We know they know lots of things, but then when they come to performance, they're either not measured correctly or they just freeze up. And so I was thinking about, pushing yourself to think about when are you uncomfortable, and how can you use that information or use that kind of emotional connection to think about what you're asking kids to do all the time. So some of my research, particularly in the area of hip hop, comes from my own personal experience teaching high school. So when I taught high school, one of the first classes I was told to teach was British literature. Now, as an English major, I had taken the 2 minimal required classes for British literature, and I hated it. And so for me then to be turned around and be told you should teach British literature to kids who are reading at best at a 6th grade reading level, go to it, I freaked out. And I really struggled, and so I reverted to all these horrible teaching methods of like using the textbook, because I'm like, I barely understand what I'm teaching. And I had one student, Julius, who was really, really bright, but he would always sit in the back of the classroom, and he would always just be rhyming, just doing hip hop lyrics in the back. And what I ended up doing was just yelling at him all the time to be quiet. But in the very back of my mind, on the days when I actually had time to reflect, I would think there's something wrong. Like, he has a skill set that I'm not able to tap into, but I just didn't know what to do with it. I knew he could do something, and I knew there was probably some way someone somewhere could tell me how to connect this to British literature, but I was too busy trying to get the kids not to fight in my classroom for me to figure it out. So several years later in graduate school, when I actually had the time then to think about that, I started thinking about what can I do with that understanding. And so when I do this kind of work, I think about kids like Julius who have expert bodies of knowledge that don't get tapped into school, and what can we do to make them be successful? Because as far as I know, Julius did not graduate. He was a junior my year, and I don't know what happened to him afterwards. And there's, and that story is kind of all too common with a lot of the students that I've worked with. Elizabeth Moji, who's a researcher at the University of Michigan, has a really nice definition of what a marginalized population is. So in academia, there's a lot of talk about, are we talking about minority populations, at-risk populations? And she talks about them as being marginalized. And she defines that kind of within the context of literacy. And so she describes the marginalized are those who are not engaged in the reading and writing in school. They have language or cultural practices different from those valued in school, or there are those who are outsiders to the dominant group because of their race, class, gender, or sexual orientation. And just, barring any sort of academic issues, I know there are a ton of kids who were reading and writing a lot outside of school, but they were not engaged in school. And so in a lot of ways, they were marginalized. And so I think about how do you bring those kids into your classroom and how do you help them connect? Fast forward to my research more recently, and what I did was I wanted to look at 2 teachers who were using hip hop in their classroom teaching. And one of the reasons I chose to do this is there are a lot of researchers who want to tell you how to use hip hop in your classroom teaching. There are people who will sell you commercial products on how to use hip hop in your classroom teaching. And I was like, well, there's got to be people who are actually already doing this. How are they doing it? Because I couldn't figure out how to do it. And so there are 2 teachers I looked at, one at a school called under the pseudonym Lake Academy, and the other was called Art School. And the pictures show kind of the difference in culture of the schools towards the kids' kind of home cultures. One, there's a sign that talks about graffiti as being criminal damage, and that if they are caught doing any sort of graffiti, they'll be suspended, they'll be charged money, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side is obviously a graffiti mural within this school that's very beautiful and is part of what kids were doing in that school. And so you see kind of already kind of what the administrators' attitudes towards what kids were bringing in outside of school were. So I went into these schools and I thought I had these really great ideas about what I was going to see with these teachers who were claiming to use hip hop in their classroom teaching. Unfortunately, when I got to actually interview one of the teachers' small groups of students, and I said, so how do you see Miss Ballard, your teacher, using hip hop in the classroom? They stared at me and they said, she uses what? I was like, hip hop. Hip hop. And as a researcher, I'm already freaking out in my mind because, I'm like, my graduate career is ruined. What am I going to do? And so I was in my head backpedaling, and I was like, okay, so you don't think she does? And they're like, no, she doesn't use it. So I ended up going with, well, why do you think she thinks she's using hip hop? And so then I went back to the teacher, and I was like, well, why do you think your kids don't think you're using hip hop? Like, why is there this big disconnect? If you're using hip hop to connect with your kids, and they're like, no, she's not using it, then what's going on? And we ended up having this whole long conversation about what hip hop means. And that's actually what the framework I'm going to talk about today is. What is hip hop and how can that be useful for teaching? So this talk is by no means saying that you should go out and buy hip hop records and play them in your class or do any horrible breakdancing or any of those things. But what I thought about was how would you describe hip hop and how can that give you a lens for good teaching in your classroom? And so hip hop can be seen as improvisational, so you make it up on the spot. So when you see break dancers, a lot of times they're not going to be choreographed, they're doing it on the spot. If you are a rapper or an MC, you can do what's called freestyling, which is you're rapping off the top of your head. And so you'll see like freestyle battles where people will be rhyming in front of each other and making fun of each other like on the fly. It's dialogic, so it talks a lot about the roots that you're coming from. So where are you coming from? What's your community? What were your experiences? It's collaborative and democratic. So even if you think about people who are breakdancers or MCs, there's a lot of audience interaction. There's a lot of energy that goes back and forth. It's evolving. So hip hop from the 1980s, with like the Fat Boys or Run DMC or even some of the beatboxing that was, like rap music back then versus what it is now is very, very different. And so it's always building on each other and kind of continuing to grow. And then finally, it's critical. One of the big roots of hip hop is critiquing society and talking about creating a space that wasn't available before. And so one of the reasons hip hop music in the 80s really took off was that it kind of echoed the lifestyle of people who were living in quote unquote the ghetto and provided a story that wasn't seen in the mainstream media at the time. And so what I started was looking at then was how can you incorporate some of these same ideas into the classroom? And it was difficult, I'll say that, because the part of me wanted to have like a worksheet to give. Like, if you do this, you will now automatically be a relevant and cool teacher. And that's what some people were selling. And that's what people want because it's the easy answer. And what I found was that it's really not. There's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done. And there's a lot of emotional energy and connection you have to have with your kids. So Florence is the teacher that I worked with, and during the time I was working in her classroom, one of her students in her school was shot outside of Saturday school. There was a lot of fallout in the school building about it. This was a senior, he was getting ready to graduate. And so she really struggled with how to help the kids connect. And so what she did was she created kind of like a memorial outside of her classroom, and she set up an area where the kids could respond, write notes to the student that had died, pass on any memories they might have had. And so she was really connecting with what was going on in the community and validating it. And that seems like a small thing, but to take time out and recognize what's going on and even ask what's going on, and realize that it's going to be an issue for kids is really is a really important thing, I think. And so, kids knew that she was open to this and that they could go to her if they needed to talk to her about it. And so always checking in and knowing what's going on. And this teacher, when I talked to her, had, lots of in-depth knowledge about where her kids were. She knew, so-and-so's had seen her, his father kill his mother, like so-and-so was homeless. And so having that connection, and she's a high school teacher, so she has, 30 kids coming in every period. And those kids were committed to her. And I think it's because she took the time to make those connections. The second part is looking at how the classroom is a community and how is there a sense of collaboration. This was actually a very humorous incident. So there was a student in the class who I call Humphrey, and he was a special ed student, very low skills, and never spoke in class. However, he was in class every day. Now, when I taught, those kids were ones that always flew under the radar. Nobody knew who they were. Nobody knew their name. Those were the kids that would fall through the cracks. One day, Humphrey was not in class, and so as Florence was going through her roster, she asked, has anyone seen Humphrey? Now, in a lot of other classrooms, I feel like the kids would have all said, who's that? What are you talking about, right? In this class, the kids knew exactly where he was, which was cutting class and sleeping in the library. And so they all demanded that they should go and get him because he was going to be missing out on some learning. And so two of the students actually went to the library and brought him back. And there was a lot of I think they were also joking about the learning he was going to miss, but I was thinking of so many classrooms I've been in where at the end of the year, even I'll say, like, has anyone seen Angela? Where, she wasn't in class today. And they'll all be like, who? I'm like, the girl that sits over there. They're like, who? Right? And she created this really strong sense of community in the classroom. All the kids knew each other's names and called each other by name. One thing that was really interesting is she's African American, taught in an all African American school, and she brought in a lot of the language practices of the Black church. And so she called all of her students brother and sister so-and-so, and she went by, instead of Mrs. Ballard, she went by Sister Ballard. Obviously doesn't work for people if you're not of that cultural background, but you can think of other ways that you can help build a community, right? And so even I remember I had a physics teacher in high school who would say, Miss and Mr. So-and-so, right? Because if you as the teacher are going to be called Miss or Mrs. Mr. So-and-so, then I'm going to have the same kind of respect for you. And so the students would actually, when they were doing discussion, they would call each other by name. They would say, well, brother so-and-so said this. And I was really, really impressed because, again, she's making this really concerted effort to create a sense of community and to create the classroom as not just a physical space, but as an emotional one as well. One of the other things that I talk about hip-hop is being democratic, so the idea of everyone having a voice or having a way to participate. And one of the reasons the teacher talked about using hip-hop was that she felt like it connected to the kids. So obviously, if your kids do not listen to hip-hop, don't try to bring this in, but what do your kids connect with? What is relevant to them, what's meaningful for them? And she talked about it specifically as hip-hop is also being global and bringing in global issues, and then also thinking about how kids are part of hip-hop culture. So she was really big on emphasizing personal responsibility and what's your part in this. And so she would say, like, you're part of this, you're part of hip-hop culture, what's your mission, what's your charge? And it makes it as part of the classroom curriculum as being relevant, and then kids are not just being intelligent scholars, but also service to the community. So again, she really pushed this idea of connection to the community and how are you part of this. One of the other things about hip-hop is it's improvisational, so you kind of make stuff up on the fly, which is a lot of teaching, right? You kind of go with things as they happen. And one of the really interesting conversations that emerged during my time in her classroom was they were reading A Raisin in the Sun, which is, pretty traditional curriculum. And she talked about, they were talking about Benita, who's one of the characters in the film too, in the book, and how she was kind of trying to choose romantically whether to be with this college guy or with this older African man, like from Africa. And this very kind of humorous exchange occurs about the differences between Africans and African Americans. And Channing, who's one of the students in the class, says, "I'm saying African Americans, we just don't do it." And so the teacher says, "We don't do what?" And he says, "We don't love. Male African Americans don't treat our women with respect." And there ensues a very kind of extensive conversation about the nature of black male-female romantic relationships. And the teacher says, "So when I met your father and mother, who were standing right outside this room during parent-teacher conferences, you're telling me your father has treated your mother wrong." And so again, she has this personal connection with her students. And he says, "I love my father, but I fault him for that, for what he did." And so he puts out kind of his own personal business, and he talks about, from my own personal standing, I know how these relationships work. And so, a lot of times people could have been like, "Oh, we're not going to talk about romantic relationships. You're getting off task. You're talking about dating. That has nothing to do with this book." But they ended up having a really intense conversation about something that's very real to them, because then it also goes on into dating violence and abuse and all these other issues, and connecting it to some of the issues in choosing and Raisin in the Sun. And so again, something that seems very distant becomes actually much more relevant to the kids, and it's again connected to being improvisational. So she could have just let it, she's like, "I have a curriculum, we're gonna stick with it," but she ends up going with it. Now, one thing that I did find that was kind of depressing is when I went to interview the students and I asked, so again, talking about the teacher, how do you see her teaching? What do you think about her as a teacher? They all loved her. They talked intensely about how they were afraid of her in some ways because she was very demanding. And so they would do her homework even though they didn't do anyone else's. But one thing they did say is they talked about, this was an American literature class I observed, and they would say they didn't think she was an American literature teacher. They thought she was a Black history teacher. And when I pushed back on that, they essentially came down to that she talked about Black people too much in American literature. And what this did for me is it made me realize how kind of Eurocentric the curriculum can be. So even when kids who are being offered, this is a curriculum that's relevant to you, they're like, well, that's not American literature, right? That's not real stuff. And so it makes me think about how often kids become desensitized to even thinking that school is a place that would reflect their own experiences or reflect their own cultural traditions. And so I would push back on that and say that that we all need to think about how we can revamp, teaching so that kids think that school or education can be much more dynamic and engaging. And kind of as a side kind of example of that is, I know when I was teaching, again with my excellent teaching skills, the most quiet I ever had in a classroom was when they were doing grammar worksheets, right? Which you would think would be mind-bogglingly boring and that would drive anyone insane, but you could hear a pin drop. And the reason for that is they knew how to do worksheets. They don't want to have an intense, deep discussion about the themes that are in the book, but they'll sit down and do a grammar worksheet. And that was really troubling for me because it made me think about what are we training our kids for? What are they really going to be able to do when they get out of school? One other thing that the teacher did is she also really brought in, she kind of, again, bringing the improvisational, brought in what the kids were doing and had them be critical of it. And so I know for some of my students, when my child and adolescent literature class, they critique me and they say, "You now make me hate all my children's classics." Because we look at things from a critical perspective and we talk about the different messages you may or may not be getting from these books. Similarly, she had kids bring in kind of their stories and watching Flavor of Love. So it's not, I don't think it's on anymore, but Flavor Flav, who was a very big rapper in the 80s, had a dating show called Flavor of Love. It was pretty horrifying. If you go online and actually watch any of the clips from it, it's really embarrassing. I won't waste your time, but if you decide you want some jollies, I think you can look it up. And so these kids were all watching it, and it's this idea that you want to be on a dating show, you're going to get with this man who has a lot of money, you're going to be rich and all these things. And she points out Flavor's a grandfather, right? So these are 15-year-old girls, and all of a sudden they're like, wait, that's not, I don't think I really want to be with someone who could be my grandfather. She talked about him as having 9 children as well as grandchildren. And she also talked about it in terms of how he had a drug addiction problem at one point, and so he was kind of an absent father. And that put, again, a very different spin on the nature of that, because a lot of the kids had those same kinds of issues in their own family life, and so they were able to make those connections, and they were able to look at something that was in the popular culture that they would normally just consume, right, blindly, and be critical of it. I've done, some of the other work I've done is also looking at critical media literacy, and so looking at, there's tons of things we're bombarded with all the time, and I think Ernest Morel talked about in his talk earlier today as well, and how do you get kids to actually consume, not just consume it blindly, but really critique some of those images and critique some of those messages. And I think about that a lot, I think also because I have a daughter, and I think about when I see girls wearing really short shorts out in the world, like what is she gonna wear when she's 12? You know, what are the issues she's gonna have? How do I not have her explode into, you know, pink princess power? And, you know, so what are the messages she's getting? And my son brings home these messages. He'll say things like, boys can't wear pink. And he doesn't hear that from me at home. And I'm like, yes, they can. He's like, no, they don't. And so, again, these are not things that are being explicitly taught at home, but these are things he's picking up out in the world about how boys are supposed to be and how girls are supposed to be. So again, if you don't give the kids those messages, if you don't reinforce them or teach them how to critique those things, they just consume like that's the truth, right? That's how things are. One other thing that I really liked in these classrooms is that a lot of times when people talk about being critical, they talk about it in terms of critiquing or of tearing down. The other teacher I haven't talked as much about, he really talked about doing world-building literacy, and that's how he called it. He talked about it in terms of what's the vision of what you want from the world. So instead of always saying, this is what's everything that's wrong, this is how the world's falling apart, you know, woe is me, what are some things you can actually contribute, and how do you build up the world you want to see? And these are just 2 examples of poems that they ended the unit with at the end of the semester. And so these are ones that kids actually wrote. And so I'll just read one of them. But it looks at, so they talk about a whole new generation starting where you left off, here to do the impossible because they said we couldn't. And so again, thinking about, these are kids who are being told, you're a gangbanger, you're an illegal immigrant, you're all these things, and then having this sense of being empowered and being able to actually take and feel like they could make a change. Same idea with the example on the left or on the right. Let's help those that are lost in the dark. Let's help them find the light where they find happiness and love. Let's show love to our loved ones. Let's not forget what we are here for, to learn a lesson. And we learned our lesson, and all we need to do is put patches on where we are damaged. Let's all together catch anyone who trips out. Let's just offer hands so we can have more help. And so really thinking about how do you embrace your community and how do you build up other people as well. And so really, I know most of these are high school examples, but again, you know, thinking about what are connections you can build with your kids, with families, with communities. One of the examples, Louis Moll, who's a researcher some of you may be familiar with, he writes a lot about funds of knowledge, and he talks about really getting to know what are the expert bodies of knowledge your kids are coming in with, because they know stuff. We might not know what they know, but how do you find out what they know? How do you build on that? And how do you help them make connections? Because I know for me, a lot of the students that I was most interested with working with were the ones that were on the edges, the ones who weren't going to make it and who didn't have that internal drive to be motivated. And so anything that kind of stood in the way of making learning more difficult or feeling more disengaging, they took it as a sign that, like, you're not meant for school, you're not meant to be here, you're not meant to do these things. And so really thinking about kind of, again, pushing back to this question I started with, so the idea of are you working for the kids, you know, in their name, but not necessarily knowing what they actually want or need? Are you working with them, and so you're finding out in conjunction and collaborating with them, or are you ultimately working against them? And I say that because if we know things in the status quo aren't working and we're not pushing to change it, then we're just kind of going along and saying it's okay. So even though we're part of a system that's really emotionally and psychically hurting kids at times, if you're not standing up and kind of pushing against that, then you're saying it's okay. And I know it's hard. I was talking to my class last night about how, in a lot of ways, school districts are kind of exploiting the fact that there aren't enough teaching jobs. And so I have adults who are certified teachers taking on roles as teacher aides, but really doing the job of a teacher. And she was saying, and my student specifically was saying that she was afraid to say anything and to say that that's not really my job, because she's like, I'm a single mom, I have to feed my kids, and I know there's 50 people who will take my job if I push back. And this is true for if you're not a tenured teacher, the idea that it's a hard market. And so there's a really difficult balance, I think, with picking out what's important to you, but what's important for the kids, but also thinking about, why did you end up in teaching? Like what draws you here and what brings you in. And so I would challenge you to really think about, what this question means for you, and then how do you know? How do you know if you're working for the kids or with the kids? Checking in, because I think so often we think we're doing what seems relevant. So in the case of Florence, we're using hip hop because she thinks it's relevant, but then they don't see it that way. But they do see how she's relevant in a lot of other ways. So the hip hop doesn't become an obstacle. So I thank you for your time so much. I thank you for all the work you guys are doing, because I know it's hard. I think most of you are elementary teachers, and I'll share a quick story. I was with my field placement class yesterday, and I had a bunch of high school teachers who are in elementary classrooms, and they only are doing half a day, and they said, we're so tired. I just want to go home and sleep. And so, coming from a secondary background, I think they thought elementary was going to be really easy, and they realized that it's just nonstop energy. So I really applaud all of you, and I hope that you have good summers, I guess, and good work. So thanks. And then I guess I can take questions.
Questions?
Just logistical here. I thought you mentioned someone named David
Stovall?
Stovall. Could you please spell his last name for me?
It's Stovall.
Vall. And what kind of knowledge?
Funds of Knowledge is what Louis Moll writes about.
Okay, could you spell that?
It's
It's fast.
It's
Okay, go ahead.
M-O-L-L, Louis, L-U-I-S, Moll, M-O-L-L.
Okay.
He was part of a large research study, and he writes extensively about funds of knowledge, but what he did was he found a lot of money to pay teachers to go home with a couple kids and learn extensively about what their families and communities knew.
Where was that?
It's in, I believe, Arizona, so it was mostly a Latino population.
Okay.
But like one example is he had like a student that wasn't very good at math, but was making a fortune bringing in candies from Mexico and reselling it to the kids. And so he wanted to, because they couldn't get it there, but he wanted to look at what are large pockets of knowledge kids know, and how can we harness that essentially for success in school.
Okay, so Moll did this research and also Stovall. No.
David Stovall talks about how education works in the sense that it keeps people in the positions they're already in.
Okay, those are the have and the have-nots.
Yes.
Okay, so that was different. Okay. Also, you said push back about 20 times. What's pushback?
I think to resist, to not go with what is being told for what you should do. And so the idea of so if you know things, policies that aren't working, how do you figure out how to be covert if you have to be in pushing back or in resisting it? And the teacher, I would argue, so Florence, when I went to get permission to go into her classroom and observe, she told me, she's like, when you go and talk to the principal, do not use the words hip hop. Do not say what you're really here to do. You're just here to see me teach. And she said because they had a set curriculum in her department and she had to follow the curriculum, she's like, but I close my door and I make sure I cover what needs to get done, but I also cover what's important to the kids.
In your experience, is this the transcending view of many teachers? That's it. Thank you.
Do I think it's what most teachers do? Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, I think it's, I think with a lot of the high stakes nature of testing, of the Common Core, all these things, people are afraid that if they don't teach in more relevant ways, or if they do teach in more relevant ways, they're not gonna cover the material they need to cover. And so there's a huge fear, especially as we talk about holding teachers accountable, and by that we mean by kids' test scores, that they're not gonna be seen as good teachers if they don't cover the test material. And that's really unfortunate.
I was wondering, without us getting the book now, if you could give us a couple of the pointers that he used to get some of the background knowledge, like we've done interest surveys before and things like that. Can you just give us a few ideas, please?
Yeah, well, his is not a typical situation because he had money to pay the teachers to actually go and do extensive home interviews, to observe the families, and to do a lot of that. But if you think about, and I actually, one of my students last night said that she did do a home interview, and that it was really enlightening. Now, obviously, people might have some issues with security depending on where your kids live. But are there ways for you to find out what kids know? Whether it's an interest survey, if you can do a home interview, if you can talk to parents. I always made a huge attempt to have personal, positive connections with parents. To some somewhat surprising results, I had, when I called home once, I had a mom talk to me for 30 minutes about how she was struggling with breast cancer, and she had no one else to talk to. And then similarly, I've had other instances where people just feel like they're just really disconnected. And so what are some ways that you can learn more about what's going on in their homes? You can, whether it's music, can you do family interviews? I recently, just in my graduate classes, I have my students do a literacy autobiography. So these are my graduate students, so these are adults, but similarly. So I have them write about their past reading and writing experiences. And so what is your relationship to reading and writing? And I'm surprised by the number of my students who hated reading and writing, who were seen as bad readers, and how this actually gives them more insight to working with their struggling students. But similarly, you could ask, it doesn't even have to be a written interview. You can ask your kids, like, do you like to read or write? Was there a teacher that helped you feel like you knew better, or are there books you like? And so, again, connecting with, finding out as much as you can.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So in your hip hop framework, when you talk about evolving, critical, democratic, where in that, because you're talking about essentially bringing in kids' personal literacies into the classroom,
Yeah.
how do you see some of those principles connecting to the Common Core?
I mean, I think, so one of the things that's interesting is, so Common Core has a lot of informational literacy, for example, in nonfiction texts. And I remember one instance where a lot of my students had people who were in jail, like family members that were in jail, and they were printing out all this information that they were finding online about where their family members were and all these things. And I was thinking, and that's, kind of a sad story, but I was also thinking about their ability to manipulate those kinds of informations. And again, I was like, there's gotta be a way I can bring that into the classroom, and I couldn't think of a way. And again, I think it was part of it was being a new teacher, but I think finding out what are some ways that are actually meaningful and relevant to your kids. And so even last night in my class, we were talking about, one of my students was a science teacher, and he's like, well, this all sounds really great, but how does this work in science? And I have a friend who's a science teacher in Chicago, and he teaches environmental science, which seems like not, it's just a bunch of content, right? But he still makes it really relevant for the kids. They still cover the material, but he talks about it in terms of the coal plants that are right by their homes, the amount of environmental pollution that's in their neighborhoods. There's a lot of work about environmental justice, for example. And so I feel like there's a lot of the standards for the Common Core can still map onto a lot of this work, because it's not content per se, right? And one of the things I really struggle with, I think the Common Core has some really great aspirations. I have some other issues with it. But I think one of the biggest issues I had was, I remember when I saw this group selling a package of like a hip hop vocabulary thing. One of the things that really rubbed me wrong about it was they were like, oh, learn how to do SAT vocabulary to do, by hip hop rhyme. And I was like, okay, that's great, but a lot of my kids are dropping out before they would ever take the SAT. So that's not really solving that major issue. And so again, thinking about, we can talk about teaching to the standards, but I feel like if you really teach in deep, meaningful, and critical ways, that you do end up covering the standards, particularly if you're engaging kids. Because you can talk about all the nonfiction texts, read how to read a manual, all these things, but if the kids feel like this has no relevance in my life, then they're not going to engage. They're not going to feel like that they need to do anything. And the kids who are going to succeed in school anyway are the ones who are going to succeed. I don't know if that was too roundabout or.
No, that's great. Any other questions? Let's please thank Dr. Kim for her presentation. And if you want to come up and ask individual questions or introduce yourself, feel free. We are going to try to be responsive this afternoon.